Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. With data breaches seemingly everywhere these days, it's no wonder you're curious about what's being done to protect our digital lives.
Definitely on topic.
Especially after you sent us this document, NIS1 and NIS2 regulations. Are they enough to prevent data breaches? So today we'll really get into those, try to understand what they are, how effective they are, and what else might be needed to truly secure that critical data.
It's a huge question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I think to really get to the heart of it, we need to look back, see how these regulations evolved, and maybe most importantly, understand their limitations.
Yeah, because just having rules on paper doesn't magically make the digital world secure, right? So NIS1, that was the EU's first big attempt at making cybersecurity standards across its member states, right? What was the thinking behind that?
Exactly. Back in 2016, the EU saw how interconnected everything was becoming digitally, and also how cyber attacks were becoming a much bigger threat. They needed a way to make all their member states have some common cybersecurity framework, like a baseline for defense across Europe.
Makes sense, like a united front against cyber threats. So what were some of the key elements of NIS1? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, NIS1 was really about establishing a solid foundation. It introduced security requirements and guidelines, mainly for things like energy, transportation, healthcare, even banking. The goal was to make these really critical sectors more secure overall.
So like a blueprint for a more resilient digital infrastructure. But you said guidelines. Does that mean NIS1 wasn't all about hard and fast rules?
That's a key point about NIS1. It leaned a lot on recommendations and best practices instead of saying, you must do this. It was more like, this is what we strongly suggest. For example, organizations were strongly encouraged to have a plan for data backup and recovery, but they weren't actually required to have one.
Interesting. So, like, strongly advising people to lock their digital doors, but not forcing them to. And I'm guessing that had some limitation.
You're absolutely right. While NIS1 was a good first step, it became pretty clear that a stronger approach was needed. Just relying on recommendations wasn't going to be enough to guarantee consistent cybersecurity across all those different sectors and member states.
So, a good starting point, but not quite the ironclad defense they were hoping for. And that leads us to NIS2, the sequel, so to speak. What prompted this upgrade, and how does it address the shortcomings of NIS1?
Well, several factors led to NIS2. The threats were constantly changing, becoming more sophisticated, targeting those essential systems. Plus, there was a growing awareness that everything's connected, so a breach in one area could cause a domino effect in others. And of course, the limitations of basically relying on a voluntary approach became increasingly obvious.
So it sounds like the EU realized they needed to up their game. Did NIS2 basically take those recommendations from NIS1 and make them actual rules?
In many cases, yes. NIS2 is much more prescriptive. It lays out specific cybersecurity measures that organizations have to implement, instead of just suggesting them. For instance, incident reporting and vulnerability disclosure, those became mandatory.
Okay, so more of a must-do than a should-do this time around. I imagine that makes compliance much more straightforward. Are there any other big changes that come to mind?
Absolutely. NIS2 broadened what's considered critical infrastructure. It includes things like social media platforms, data centers, even public administration. So the scope is much wider than what was in NIS1.
Wow, so it's not just about protecting those obvious targets anymore. They're casting a much wider net. It sounds like NIS2 really beefed up those defenses, going beyond just suggesting best practices. But I have to ask, what does this mean for organizations on the ground? Were there any concerns about how these more stringent requirements might play out in the real world?
Definitely concerns, and some are still being debated. A big one was the potential burden on smaller organizations. Implementing all these new cybersecurity measures, especially those demanding specific technical expertise, can be quite costly, especially for businesses with limited resources.
Right, because cybersecurity isn't exactly cheap, and not every organization has a dedicated IT department, let alone a team of cybersecurity specialists.
Exactly, and that raises questions about whether there's enough support available to help those smaller organizations meet the requirements of NIS2 without being completely overwhelmed. The last thing you want is for these security measures to become a barrier to entry for smaller businesses or hold back innovation.
That's a really important point. Cybersecurity shouldn't be something only those with deep pockets can afford. It needs to be accessible to everyone. So, while NIS2 sounds like a significant step forward in terms of strengthening cybersecurity, it seems there are still some kinks to work out, especially when it comes to making sure that all organizations, regardless of their size, can realistically comply. What about the human element? Even with the best regulations and technology, human error can still lead to data breaches, right? How does NIS2 address that?
That's a really good question, and it gets to the heart of one of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity. NIS2 does touch on the human element. It emphasizes security awareness training and having regular drills to test how well people can respond to incidents. It recognizes that a well-trained workforce is essential to maintaining a strong security posture.
So it's not just about the technical side of things, it's about creating a culture of cybersecurity within organizations where everyone knows the risks and feels responsible for protecting data.
Exactly, because even with the most sophisticated firewalls and intrusion detection systems, a single careless click on a phishing email can completely undo all those defenses.
Oh, I've heard some scary stories about those phishing scams. They can be incredibly convincing. So it seems like NIS2, while definitely stronger than its predecessor, still leaves some room for improvement. What are some areas where these regulations could be strengthened or expanded to better address the evolving challenges of cybersecurity?
One area that could use more attention is supply chain security. Today's digital world is incredibly interconnected, and a vulnerability in one part of the supply chain can impact entire industries. NIS2 could be improved by having more specific rules on how organizations should assess and manage the risks associated with their suppliers and vendors.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like reinforcing the walls of your fortress, but leaving the back gate wide open. You're only as strong as your weakest link, right?
Precisely. And another area where NIS2 could be enhanced is in its approach to data encryption. Encryption is really powerful for protecting sensitive information. Stronger requirements around data encryption, both in transit and at rest, could significantly reduce the impact of data breaches.
So making it much harder for those attackers to actually use the data, even if they do manage to breach the defenses. Okay, so we've talked about the shortcomings of NIS1, the improvements brought about by NIS2, and some potential areas for further improvement. But the big question remains, are these regulations actually effective in preventing data breaches? I mean, regulations are a necessary framework, but can they really keep pace with the constant evolution of cyber threats?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It's hard to measure the exact impact of regulations like NIS2 on the number of data breaches. Cybersecurity is this complex game of cat and mouse, and attackers are always coming up with new ways to exploit vulnerabilities.
So it's not a matter of simply setting up the rules and then sitting back and relaxing, thinking the job is done. It's an ongoing process of adaptation and improvement. I'm curious to hear more about the effectiveness of NIS2 and what other strategies might be needed to truly enhance data security. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to clarify something you mentioned earlier, the 3-2-1 backup rule. I know you touched on this briefly, but can you explain what it is and why it's so important in the context of data protection? I think our listeners would really benefit from understanding this concept.
Absolutely. The 3-2-1 rule is a fundamental principle of data backup and recovery, and it's surprisingly simple. Basically, it recommends having 3 copies of your data stored on 2 different types of media, with at least 1 copy kept off-site.
Okay, so 3 copies in total, 2 different storage mediums, and 1 copy located somewhere else entirely. That sounds like a pretty thorough approach to data redundancy. But why is it so crucial, especially in today's world of ransomware attacks and other cyber threats?
Well, imagine if your main data storage system is hit by a ransomware attack. All your files are encrypted, and you're locked out. Without a proper backup, you're basically at the mercy of the attackers. They have control over your data, and they'll likely demand a hefty ransom to unlock it.
That sounds like a total nightmare. So the 3-2-1 rule gives you multiple layers of protection in case 1 or even 2 of your backups are compromised.
Exactly. By having 3 separate copies of your data stored differently and in different locations, you greatly reduce the risk of losing everything in a single incident. It's all about minimizing the impact of a potential data loss and making sure your business can keep running.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's like having multiple escape routes if your main fortress is breached. But here's a question. Is the 3-2-1 rule a mandatory requirement under NIS2, or is it more of a best practice that organizations are encouraged to adopt?
That's a great question, and it highlights an important point about NIS2. While it doesn't specifically say you must follow the 3-2-1 rule, it does strongly emphasize having robust data backup and recovery mechanisms. It's considered a core part of any solid cybersecurity strategy, and organizations are expected to do what's needed to ensure their data is available and protected.
So even if it's not explicitly spelled out in the regulations, the 3-2-1 rule is very much in line with the overall goal of NIS2 and is something any organization that's serious about protecting its data should strongly consider. I think we've laid a really good foundation here understanding how these NIS regulations came about and the importance of things like data backups and redundancy. But let's shift gears for a minute and look at some real-world examples. Can you tell me about a company that's done a great job of creating a strong cybersecurity culture, and what are some of their key strategies? I think our listeners would love to hear about a success story in this often daunting world of cybersecurity.
Absolutely. There's this global financial institution that really stands out. They've truly embraced a cybersecurity culture and made it part of everything they do. One of their main strategies has been to invest heavily in security awareness training for every single employee, not just the IT folks.
That's smart because let's face it, most people tune out during those dry technical lectures. So, how do they keep the training engaging?
They've made it fun, like a game. They use real-life scenarios and simulations to help employees understand what can happen based on their actions. For example, they might simulate a phishing attack and see how many people fall for it. Then they'll discuss the exercise, explaining how the attack worked and what people could have done to avoid it.
So, it's about putting people in the hot seat, so to speak, and giving them a chance to learn from their mistakes in a safe space.
Exactly. And they don't stop at training. They also conduct regular phishing campaigns to test how vigilant their employees are. They send out fake phishing emails that are designed to trick people into clicking on bad links or giving away sensitive information.
Wow, so they're really putting their employees through their paces. But I can see how that would be super effective in reinforcing the importance of cybersecurity. So it's not just about telling people what to do, it's about giving them real opportunities to practice and sharpen their skills.
Precisely. And this company goes even further. They've created a culture where everyone feels comfortable reporting any suspicious activity without being afraid of getting in trouble. They understand that mistakes happen, and they'd much rather someone report a potential problem early on than try to hide it and make things worse.
That's a really crucial point. It's about having trust and transparency where people feel safe to speak up when they see something that seems off. Okay, so this financial institution has obviously put a lot of time and effort into creating a strong cybersecurity culture. But has it worked? Have they seen fewer security incidents because of these efforts?
Absolutely. They've seen a significant drop in successful phishing attacks and other security incidents since they started these programs. They've also noticed that their employees are much more aware of security in general and are better at spotting and reporting potential threats.
That's impressive. It sounds like they've really figured out how to build a culture of cybersecurity. But I'm sure it hasn't been easy. What were some of the obstacles they faced in setting up these programs?
One of the biggest challenges was getting people to embrace change. Initially, some employees saw the security training as a chore or a distraction from their real work. It took time and effort to convince everyone that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility, not just something for the IT department to worry about.
I can imagine that. It's easy to get wrapped up in your daily tasks and lose sight of the bigger picture. But these days, cybersecurity is definitely part of the bigger picture, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this company did a great job of getting that message across. They made it clear that security is everyone's job, and they gave everyone the tools or resources they needed to play their part.
That's a great takeaway. Cybersecurity isn't just about technology and rules, it's about people. It's about creating an environment where everyone understands the risks and takes responsibility for protecting data. I think this story is a really inspiring example of what's possible when organizations approach cybersecurity holistically.
I agree. And it reminds us that building a strong cybersecurity culture is a continuous process, not a one-time fix. It takes constant awareness, adaptation, and a willingness to learn and improve.
Well said. Okay, so we've seen how one company successfully tackled the human side of cybersecurity, but I'm curious about the flip side. Can you tell me about an organization that maybe struggled to implement effective cybersecurity and what contributed to their challenges? I think it would be helpful to compare this success story with a less fortunate example.
Sure, there was this case with a major healthcare provider that had a big data breach a few years ago. They had lots of security measures in place, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, the works. But their major weakness was their employees.
Oh, so even with all the tech and safeguards, human error can still be the downfall.
Exactly. In this case, the breach happened because an employee accidentally opened a phishing email and clicked a bad link. That gave the attackers a way into the network, and from there, they could access and steal sensitive patient data.
Wow, just one click can lead to such disastrous consequences. It really highlights the importance of the human element we've been discussing. But I'm wondering, why wasn't this employee more aware of the dangers of phishing? Didn't they have any security awareness training?
They had some training, but it wasn't very often, and it wasn't very engaging. It was mostly just PowerPoint slides and lectures about security policies. It didn't really connect with the employees, and it didn't give them the practical skills they needed to spot and avoid phishing attacks.
So the training was more about checking a box than genuinely empowering employees to be part of the security solution.
I think that's a good way to put it. And sadly, this lack of effective training had real consequences. The data breach ended up costing the healthcare provider millions in fines and legal fees, not to mention the damage to their reputation and the trust they lost with their patients.
Ouch, that's a heavy price to pay for overlooking the human side of cybersecurity. So it sounds like the lack of engaging and effective security awareness training was a big factor in this breach. Were there any other things that contributed to it?
Yes, another problem was that security policies weren't clearly communicated or enforced. They had policies, but employees didn't really know about them, and there wasn't much done to make sure people followed them.
So even if they had good policies on paper, if no one knew about them or felt like they had to follow them, they were practically useless.
Exactly. And because of that, security was often seen as an afterthought or something you could just skip if it got in the way. It wasn't truly part of how the organization operated.
Okay, so this healthcare provider's story is a cautionary tale about what can happen when organizations fail to consider the human side of cybersecurity. They had all the technical safeguards in place, but they overlooked the people, and it ended up costing them big time.
It's a reminder that cybersecurity goes beyond just technology. It's about people, processes, and culture. You have to have all those things working together to create a truly secure environment.
Well said. I think we've had a really productive conversation so far, laying the groundwork for understanding the NIS regulations and the broader challenges of cybersecurity. We've explored the pros and cons of NIS1 and NIS2, talked about the importance of data backups in the 321 rule, and even looked at real-world examples of organizations that have both excelled and stumbled with cybersecurity. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something you said about how effective regulations like NIS2 really are. You
Okay.
mentioned that it's tough to measure their direct impact on how many data breaches actually happen. I'd love to hear more about why that's the case and what other factors might be involved.
It's a complicated issue, and there are a few reasons why it's so hard to pinpoint exactly how much regulations affect data breach numbers. First off, the threats are constantly changing. Cybercriminals are always coming up with new ways to exploit weaknesses and get around security measures. So even if regulations help close some gaps, new ones are constantly popping up.
So it's a never-ending arms race, with the good guys always trying to keep up with the bad guys.
Exactly. And another factor is the sheer volume of data breaches. Many breaches go unreported, so it's tough to know how big the problem really is. That makes it even harder to evaluate how effective any security measure is, whether it's a regulation, technology, or a training program.
Okay, so we're dealing with a constantly moving target and incomplete data, which makes it hard to draw any firm conclusions. Are there any other things that complicate the picture?
Yes, the human element, which we've already talked about, is another big factor. Even with the best regulations and technologies, people can make mistakes that lead to data breaches. And human behavior is really hard to predict and control.
That's true. We can try to educate and train people, but we can't completely eliminate the risk of human error. So it seems like we're dealing with a really complex web of factors, making it difficult to say definitively whether regulations like NIS2 are actually successful in stopping data breaches. But does that mean these regulations aren't worth having?
Not at all. Regulations like NIS2 are important for setting a basic level of security and encouraging good practices. They give organizations a framework to follow and help make sure everyone is at least playing by the same rules.
So they level the playing field and provide a foundation for organizations to build their own cybersecurity strategies.
Exactly. And while we may not be able to measure their direct effect on the number of data breaches, regulations like NIS2 are definitely helping to raise awareness of cybersecurity and encouraging organizations to take it more seriously.
That's a good point. By making cybersecurity a legal requirement, it forces organizations to pay attention and put resources towards it, which is a good first step. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, from how the NIS regulations came about to the importance of data backups, the hurdles of building a strong cybersecurity culture, and the difficulty of measuring how effective these measures actually are.
I agree. It's been a good overview.
But we've really only scratched the surface. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll go deeper into the specifics of NIS2, see how it could potentially impact various sectors, and explore what other strategies beyond regulations might be needed to really bolster data security in our increasingly connected world.
Looking forward to it. So going back to what we were talking about before, I think it's worth pointing out that while NIS2 doesn't specifically say you have to use the 3-2-1 backup rule, it does kind of steer organizations in that direction.
Interesting. So even without a direct order, the regulations sort of nudge organizations towards those best practices.
Exactly. For instance, NIS2 says that organizations need to implement appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures to manage cybersecurity risks. That includes things like making sure network and information systems are secure, dealing with security incidents, and making sure the business can keep running even if there's a disruption.
Okay, so it's less about dictating a specific solution and more about establishing a framework for risk management, which naturally leads organizations to consider best practices like data backups and recovery plans.
You got it. And NIS2 also emphasizes this idea of proportionality. That means the security measures should match the level of risk an organization faces. So a small business with not a lot of sensitive data wouldn't be expected to have the same level of security as a huge corporation that handles tons of personal information.
Makes sense. It wouldn't be practical or necessary to have the same cybersecurity standards for everyone, regardless of their size or what they do. So it sounds like NIS2 tries to balance setting clear expectations while also allowing for some flexibility.
Exactly. I think that's one of the strengths of NIS2. It recognizes that cybersecurity isn't one size fits all. It's more of a framework that can be adapted to different situations rather than a rigid set of rules.
That's a good point. Flexibility is really important in a field that's as dynamic and ever-changing as cybersecurity. But I'm curious, how does NIS2 address the unique challenges of different sectors? I mean, a healthcare provider probably has different cybersecurity needs than a social media platform, right?
Absolutely. NIS2 is designed with those differences in mind. It understands that each industry has its own cybersecurity challenges. Take healthcare, for example. They're very sensitive to data breaches because they can put patient privacy and safety at risk. So NIS2 really emphasizes data protection and confidentiality for healthcare.
Makes sense. Protecting patient records is obviously super important. What about other sectors? Are there other ways that NIS2 tailors its requirements to specific industries?
Yeah, another good example is the energy sector. Power grids and critical infrastructure are more and more reliant on digital technologies, which makes them prime targets for cyber attacks. Those attacks could disrupt essential services. NIS2 addresses that by requiring specific security measures for energy providers, things like strong incident response plans and regular checks for vulnerabilities.
So they're recognizing how interconnected our critical systems are and how a problem in one area can cascade into others.
Exactly. And that's a big improvement over NIS1, which was more general and didn't really consider the specific needs of different industries.
Okay, so NIS2 seems to be making progress in addressing the unique challenges of different sectors. But what about enforcement? I mean, regulations are only as good as how well they're enforced, right? What does NIS2 do to make sure organizations are actually following these new rules?
That's a great point. NIS2 gives national authorities more power to penalize organizations that don't comply. Those penalties can include fines, public reprimands, and even suspension of operations in some cases.
Wow, so the regulations have some teeth. That should make organizations think twice about ignoring cybersecurity.
Definitely. And another important aspect is the requirement for regular audits and inspections. National authorities can come in and check to make sure organizations are meeting the requirements. This adds another layer of accountability and ensures that compliance isn't just something on paper.
And so it's not just about hoping that organizations will do the right thing. There's an active system in place to make sure they're following the rules. That's good to know. But what about the potential cost of complying with these regulations, especially for smaller organizations? Is that a concern?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Putting all the necessary security measures in place, especially those that need specialized knowledge, can be expensive. NIS2 takes that into account and encourages member states to provide help to smaller organizations to help them meet those requirements.
That's good to hear. It wouldn't make sense if these regulations ended up hurting smaller businesses or making it harder for them to innovate. Are there any specific examples of the kinds of help member states might offer?
Sure, there are things like financial assistance, like grants or subsidies to offset those costs. They could also provide technical assistance, like giving them access to cybersecurity experts or guidance on how to comply with the rules.
So it's not just a case of setting rules and expecting everyone to figure it out on their own. They understand that support and collaboration are really important, especially for smaller organizations that may not have the resources to do this all themselves.
Precisely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from NIS2. It's not just about regulations. It's about building a safer online world for everyone. And that takes collaboration and support across all sectors.
That's a great point. Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, not just an IT problem. We all need to work together to make it better. But are there any parts of NIS2 that have been criticized or face pushback? I mean, no regulation is perfect, right? I'm sure there are people who have concerns about how it could affect things.
You're right, there will always be critics. One of the main concerns people have raised about NIS2 is the potential for too much regulation. Some argue that the rules are too specific and could slow down innovation by burdening businesses.
That's an interesting point. So there's a tension between needing strong security and wanting to encourage innovation and economic growth. How do you see that playing out?
It's a delicate balancing act, and I think policymakers need to be aware of that as they put NIS2 into practice. The goal is to strike a balance where we improve security without making it too difficult for businesses to operate.
That makes sense. It's about finding that middle ground where security and innovation can both thrive. Are there any other criticisms of NIS2 you've come across?
Another concern is that the regulations are pretty complex. NIS2 is a long and detailed document, and some organizations are worried about how difficult it is to understand and follow all the rules.
I can see that. Dealing with complicated regulations can be a headache, especially for smaller organizations that don't have dedicated legal or compliance teams.
Exactly, and this really underscores the need for clear guidance and support from the authorities to help organizations make sense of the regulations.
So even if the intentions are good, if the regulations are too complex or hard to understand, they might not be effective.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important for policymakers to work closely with industry to make sure the regulations are practical and something businesses can actually implement.
Okay, so we've got the potential for overregulation and the complexity of the regulations as two possible drawbacks of NIS2. Anything else you think is important to mention?
Yeah, one more concern is the potential for inconsistencies. NIS2 is an EU regulation, but it's up to each individual member state to put it into practice and enforce it. That could lead to differences in how the rules are applied in different countries, which could create confusion and complexity for businesses that operate across borders.
That's a good point. Consistency and clarity are essential for any regulation to work effectively. So even though NIS2 provides a common framework, there's still a risk that different countries might interpret and implement it differently.
Exactly, and that's why it's really important for member states to work closely together to make sure there's a unified approach to implementation and enforcement.
So it's not just about setting the rules, it's about making sure those rules are applied consistently across the entire EU.
Precisely. And I think that's an ongoing challenge with any regulation that tries to create a level playing field across different countries.
Okay, so we've explored some potential downsides of NIS2, like concerns about overregulation, complexity, and inconsistencies. But even with those challenges, do you think NIS2 is a positive step forward for cybersecurity in Europe?
Yeah, overall, I think NIS2 is a good thing. It makes the EU's cybersecurity framework stronger, widens its scope, and provides better ways to enforce the rules. There are definitely challenges, but I think it's a significant step towards a more secure digital world for everyone.
That's good to hear. And it seems like people are realizing that regulations alone aren't enough to solve the complex and constantly changing challenges of cybersecurity. What other strategies, beyond just rules, do you think are crucial for improving data security in today's interconnected world?
That's a great question. Regulations provide a foundation, but they're not the whole solution. One essential element is collaboration. We need to get rid of those silos and encourage organizations, industries, and even countries to share information. The more we know about threats and vulnerabilities, the better prepared we'll be to defend against them.
So it's about presenting a united front against these threats, recognizing that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And another important aspect is education and awareness. We need to give people the knowledge and skills they need to protect themselves and their data. That includes things like basic cyber hygiene, all the way to more advanced cybersecurity training for IT professionals.
So investing in people, recognizing that they can be both the weakest point and the greatest asset when it comes to cybersecurity.
Exactly. And we also need to keep investing in research and development. The threats are constantly changing, and we need to stay ahead of the curve by developing new technologies and strategies to combat them.
That makes sense. Cybersecurity is a moving target, and we have to keep up with what's happening on the other side.
Absolutely. And one last thing I'd like to emphasize is the importance of a culture of security. Rules and technology can only go so far. Ultimately, we need to create a culture where everyone understands that security is their responsibility. People should be aware of the risks and take steps to protect themselves and their data.
So it's about changing mindsets and making security part of the fabric of our organizations and society.
Exactly. And that's a long-term goal that requires constant effort and commitment from everyone.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of important points in this part of our deep dive. We've looked at the details of NIS2, its impact on different industries, the difficulties of enforcing it, and the importance of things like collaboration, education, research, and a security-conscious culture.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
But there's even more to explore. In the last part of our deep dive, we'll step back and look at the bigger picture, considering what NIS2 could mean for cybersecurity in Europe and beyond. We'll also discuss some of the new trends and technologies that are shaping the landscape, and we'll offer some practical advice for individuals and organizations that want to strengthen their defenses. All right, so we've gone deep into the nitty-gritty of NIS2, and it's pretty clear that this isn't just a minor update to how we do cybersecurity.
Definitely not. It's a major change in how the EU approaches cybersecurity, with the goal of creating a stronger, more resilient digital environment across all the member states.
And what's really interesting to me is how this legislation could have a ripple effect. We talked about the impact on different sectors, but what about the broader picture? Could NIS2 influence cybersecurity standards and practices even outside the EU?
Oh, absolutely. The EU is a major player on the global stage, both economically and politically, and their regulations often have a global influence. NIS2 sets a high bar for cybersecurity, and I think a lot of countries and organizations outside the EU will look to it as a model for their own cybersecurity frameworks.
So it could become a kind of de facto standard, even in countries that aren't bound by the EU's regulations.
Exactly, and I think that's a good thing. Having a more unified approach to cybersecurity globally would benefit everyone. It would help even the playing field, reduce complexity, and encourage more collaboration in fighting cyber threats.
That makes a lot of sense. A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. And speaking of rising tides, what are some of the new trends and technologies that you see shaping the future of cybersecurity? What should we be keeping an eye on?
Well, one trend that's hard to ignore is the rise of artificial intelligence, AI. AI is being used on both sides of cybersecurity, both offensively and defensively. Attackers are using AI to make their attacks more sophisticated and harder to detect.
So AI is being used to make the attacks themselves smarter.
Exactly, they can automate attacks, making them harder to defend against. But on the other hand, defenders are also using AI to improve their security systems. They're using it to automate threat detection and response, and even to try and predict future attacks.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. AI can be used for good or for bad, depending on who's using it.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important to understand the potential risks and benefits of AI, and to come up with strategies for managing those risks responsibly.
It's not about being afraid of AI, it's about understanding it and using it in a way that benefits everyone. Are there any other new trends you think are worth mentioning?
Another big one is the focus on cloud security. More and more organizations are moving their data and operations to the cloud, which makes the cloud a bigger target for cyber criminals. So we're seeing a lot of new technologies and practices focused on keeping data and applications in the cloud secure.
Right, the cloud itself isn't necessarily insecure, but it does create new security challenges that organizations need to understand and address.
Exactly. And another trend that's becoming more popular is the concept of zero trust. Traditionally, security was all about building a wall around your network and trusting anyone inside that wall. But zero trust is different. It assumes that no one and no device should be trusted automatically, and everything needs to be verified.
So it's like moving away from that fortress mentality and instead having security checks everywhere, at every door and window.
Precisely, and that makes it much harder for attackers to move around inside a network, even if they manage to get in.
That's a really interesting concept. It seems like a more realistic and flexible approach to security in today's complex and interconnected world.
I agree, and I think we'll see zero trust become even more important in the coming years.
Okay, so AI, cloud security, and zero trust are three big trends to watch. Anything else you would add to that list?
One more I'd mention is the importance of cybersecurity awareness and training. As cyber attacks get more sophisticated, it's more important than ever for everyone, individuals and organizations, to understand the risks and how to protect themselves.
We've talked a lot about the human factor throughout this deep dive, and it seems like that's only going to become more critical as the threats evolve.
Absolutely. Human error is still one of the biggest weaknesses in cybersecurity, and we need to do everything we can to educate and empower people to be part of the solution.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the details of NIS2 and its impact to broader trends in cybersecurity. But before we finish, I want to give our listeners some practical advice. What are some concrete things that individuals and organizations can do to improve their cybersecurity?
Well, for individuals, the basics are still the most important. Use strong, unique passwords for every account. Turn on two-factor authentication whenever you can. Be careful about suspicious emails and links, and keep your software updated with the latest security patches.
Those are all great reminders and things that anyone can do, even without a lot of technical knowledge. What about for organizations? What advice would you give them?
For organizations, I'd say focus on creating a culture of security. Make it clear that everyone is responsible for cybersecurity, not just the IT department. Invest in security awareness training for all employees, create clear security policies, and regularly test your defenses with things like penetration testing and vulnerability assessments.
So, taking a comprehensive approach, understanding that cybersecurity isn't just about technology, but also about people, processes, and culture.
Exactly. And one last piece of advice is to stay informed. The world of cybersecurity is constantly changing, and it's important to keep up with the latest threats and vulnerabilities. Read security newsletters, follow industry experts on social media, attend conferences, anything you can do to stay in the loop.
Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about and hopefully some tools to improve their own cybersecurity.
I hope so. It's been a great discussion.
It has. Cybersecurity is an ongoing journey, not a one-time fix, and it takes constant vigilance and adaptation. But by working together, sharing information, and staying informed, we can make the digital world a safer place for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into NIS regulations and the future of cybersecurity. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope you've learned something new and useful.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in and taking an active interest in your digital security. Until next time, stay safe out there in the digital world.
Oh, I'm